So welcome everyone. This is meeting number 54 of the Blood Transfusion Education and Discussion Group. So my name is Selma and I'm here with my co-host Natasha. So we're pleased to welcome today's speaker Harriet Grey, who is the Supply Chain Planning Manager at NHS Blood and Transplant. Harriet has been with NHS BT for 9 years and she began her journey as a senior PA. So for the past 5 years, she has worked with the central planning team in both demand and supply roles, and she's currently a supply chain leadership degree apprenticeship through NHSBT. So today's session will offer insights into how hospital demand is translated into blood supply planning, specifically across red blood cells, platelets, and plasma. And Harriet will also highlight some of the complexities involved in managing our unique and critical supply chain. So before we begin, I'll just quickly go through the housekeeping. So this session is being recorded, and by staying on this call, you're providing consent to be part of this recording. So most of our sessions are uploaded on our YouTube channel. And if you subscribe to it, then you'll be notified when new content is uploaded.
Thank you. And as Selma has said, my name is Harriet. I'm here to talk about how we plan to meet hospital demand across red cells, platelets and plasma. And I'll look to try and share with you as well what makes our supply chain so complex and unique and actually really fun to work in. So just starting with our supply chain, and it'd be great if we can get some comments in the chat for this one. So be ready to be typing for this one. But if we think about a typical supply chain, so think of something like the fashion industry, for example, then actually we might see a supply flow like that first diagram. So we might start with our demand. We might look at, raw materials, things like cotton, that are then manufactured and processed. And then we go through to kind of, decisions that our supply managers might be making here around actually how do we make sure that we're trading off between quality and price, how much stock to order, and the impact of too much stock on landfill, perhaps. So, thinking around the environmental concerns there. And even things like regulations across different countries. So we know that we take the fashion industry as an example. We know that there are different countries, not just the UK, that are making clothing, and therefore how does that clothing get shipped? Implications on things like labour laws. I know it's probably quite different to think about our industry as a supply chain, but that's kind of how we see it. And actually, our supply chain does look quite different. So I suppose this is where, if people are ready, what do you think makes our supply chain unique, or why could it be seen as more complex compared to the fashion industry? Are there any thoughts about that? Give you a minute or so to have a think. Fluctuating demand, yeah, exactly. Expiry dates, yep. Perishable temperature, yep. Regulations, yep. Cold chain, expiry, unpredictable demand, yep. All great answers. Donors are voluntary, yep, great. Yep. Great answers in the chat, thank you. So yeah, totally agree with a lot of these coming through, and actually you guys have stolen my answers. So yeah, I think really great to see those answers coming through. So exactly as has been called out in the chat, some of the differences are things like our material. So actually, if we think about blood, we're not buying that, we're not ordering stock. We're relying on donors altruistically coming in and giving donations, but we don't necessarily have control over that. So in the fashion industry, we might, if we have a problem with a supplier, we might go to a different supplier to produce the materials that we need. But of course, we can't necessarily do that with our blood donors. And secondly, we obviously, if we're talking about the trade-off that we do within the fashion industry, and that trade-off that you would see between quality and price, So, if you think about some of the retailers that might be looking at, actually, how do I make this as cheaply as possible? They may be less concerned about the quality. Equally, the other way around, they might be really concerned about quality and less concerned about price, because they'll pass that price on to consumers. Actually, we know within NHS BT, we obviously don't want to produce units at high cost, because we know that will impact on hospitals. But we can't compromise on quality. We want to make sure that the units are meticulously managed, including testing and things like that, to make sure that they are as safe as possible for patients at the end of it. Now, I suppose, in contrast, what about the food industry? So quite often I will hear people compare us to the food industry. Any thoughts about how we could, or how we're linked to the food industry? Any similarities or differences? And again, if you want to pop that in the chat, that's great. I'll have a little look. Cold chain, yep. Perishable, temperature control, yep. Exactly right. Yep. Yeah, going inside our bodies and can harm, exactly. Expiry, yeah, good stuff. Unpredictable weather, yep. Yes, absolutely. Good stuff. Thank you for that. So yeah, exactly that. So we can see there are some similarities. So things like the food industry is heavily regulated, and they also have to consider shelf life. So, if we think about things like milk or yogurts, we have to be thinking about the shelf life there. However, if we think about that compared to our supply chain for blood, actually food production can often be scaled up fairly quickly. Whereas, again, blood is being voluntarily donated and not produced on demand. And again, around that kind of shelf life for the food industry, if a product isn't available, then customers could actually self-substitute. So, if you went into the supermarket and you wanted mature cheddar cheese and there wasn't any, you could buy the mild cheddar and you would self-substitute. Actually, for blood supply, if we have a mismatch, that could potentially be life-threatening for patients at the end of it. And particularly in trauma cases, we know that Group O red cells might be the only blood product that could be used due to not having ABO matching available for patients. So I hope that kind of gives some flavour as to why our supply chain is so complex. So if I just delved a little bit deeper into our supply chain as a whole. So you might have seen this slide before. It isn't mine, I should say, but I really like how it illustrates some of our complexities around blood supply planning, and how we coordinate this activity. So you can see lots of different activity that we do to try and support with collection of blood. And one of the areas that I was going to pick on particularly is one that's in the top left, so where it says pack type request. So this is something that's done by my team. And what this means is that for each unit of blood that's collected, we actually determine what type of pack it goes into. And what that means is when it's collected into a specific pack, that will determine whether we can get red cells, buffy coats and plasma from that unit, or just red cells and plasma. And that's something we do within my team. And that information is delivered on handheld devices. So when a donor turns up at session, we'll be saying, okay, we want to put those into this pack type, and we want to put that donor into this pack type. So it's, as you can probably see just from that small example, a very complex supply chain, and even just individual parts obviously have lots of activity that sit behind them. And just talking about my team specifically, again, in terms of individual products, we plan our business plan, our collection requirements for all of the products that I mentioned, so red cells, plasma and platelets. And when I say plasma, I mean FFP and cryo. But we have very little control over that red cell supply coming through. And the reason for that is, we don't have the responsibility for bringing those donors in, but we are making sure that we plan to meet collection requirements at the start of it. However, for a product like platelets, we have about 50% control over platelet supply, and we'll talk a little bit more about platelet supply later on, and around 99% control. There's a little bit, again, that we don't quite have control over in plasma supply, and again, I'll come on to that shortly. and that's just talking about the units we're looking to make by ABO group. Okay, so diving a little bit more into each product, so starting with how we plan to meet red cell demand. So just in terms of this graph, just to explain what this is showing, we set our collection requirements against what we're expecting our demand to be. So when we talk about demand, this is our actual requests from hospitals, when we talk about actual demand. And we calculate our demand forecast going forward using our historical demand data. And we also have intelligence from our demand review group as well. So we have colleagues from our patient blood management team there, as well as blood stocks management scheme, as well as some clinicians, which help support with understanding any intelligence or any changes that could be coming that might increase or decrease the requirement for our blood demand. So things like automated red cell exchanges, we know will require an increase in our red cell demand, and we will look to include those within our demand forecast going forward. We will then translate that, that's the grey line, our demand forecast. We will then translate that into an issues forecast. So we know, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on, but we know that we can't meet all of our RO demand, for example. And we also know that there will be some substitutions that take place as well across other groups. So as part of that issues forecast, we'll take those into account. And then on top of that, we will translate all of that into a collection requirement. So what we'll be saying in our collection requirement is we expect for some units to be discarded, either due to expiry of unit or due to wastage reasons. So it could be a donor-specific reason, or it could be a fault within the pack, something like that, that we have to make a discard for. So with that in mind, we collect slightly higher than our demand to make sure that we are taking into account those reasons for wastage as well. And for ANEG specifically, we actually set our collection requirements above our red cell demand. So when we plan our collection requirements, we will set them to say, what do we need to meet demand, as this is showing, but actually ANEG is above that red cell demand. And the reason for that is we, when we're taking into account our platelet demand, so we do a similar exercise for platelets, what we tend to find for platelets is that because of the high levels of ANEG requirement, we don't have enough red cell or whole blood coming through for ANEG to be able to support for platelet pooling. So what that means is we have to increase our collection requirements for ANEG specifically to be able to support platelet pooling, because it is the universal group for platelets, or it's seen as a universal group for platelets. So we do tend to see high levels of demand for that group, which does put pressure on us from a supply side. So for interest, I just thought I'd include what our collection levels have looked like in terms of target versus forecast for each of the 8 blood groups on here by ABO. And what you can see on here is that we collect more consistently to target for our POS groups, but less so for our NEG groups. And specifically for ANEG, which is the top left-hand corner, what we can see there is that actually we don't consistently collect near target as it stands. Unfortunately, that does put more pressure on our ANEG platelet supply chain, because while we are broadly sufficient and can meet that red cell level, because it is lower to meet demand for red cells, we do see under collection to meet that pooling requirement that I mentioned. So just wanted to share that for interest. So moving on to a bit of a deeper dive into other products that we, or other areas that we think about when we're planning red cells. So RO is one of the big things that we plan for and we take into account when we're making our collection requirements. Again, similar chart to the last one, the grey line is showing our demand. The blue line is showing our collection requirement. And again, that takes into account what we're expecting to expire and waste in terms of discards at a total level. But actually what we know from the outset with RO is that we don't expect to be able to achieve 100% of our collection requirement. we do have a gap between the amount of donors that we have that are RO versus the demand that we see for RO units. So we can see that in the green line. So the green line is what we expect to be able to meet. And you can see that's about 61% of our current collection requirements for RO. And what this means is we have to put extra pressure onto ONEG and BNEG particularly, because actually around 39% of our RO requirement is substituted with other units. So we see 57% from ONEG and 24% from BNEG. And actually what we've seen over the last few months is that collection has been around 90% of expected, so that green line, which does place further pressure on ONEG and BNEG as they'll be used for substitutions. So obviously if we can improve collection of RO, that will reduce some of the pressure on ONEG and BNEG, and obviously be better for patients if we can more accurately match what patients are needing. So in terms of actual collection, again for RO, and again this line to show the target is 100% of the expected collection, so not the collection requirement. But what we can see here is that prior to April, we're broadly collecting in line with our targets for all groups. You can see there are some months where we don't quite manage to hit that target. As I say, this is assuming we can achieve about that 60% of requirement rather than a full 100%. We have seen a slight drop since April, which will put more pressure on the negative groups to be able to substitute. So that was my slides on red cells. So I'll move on to platelets next. And what I will say up front is platelets is the most complex out of all of the products that we supply or we supply plan. And I'll explain a few of the reasons why. So starting with how we plan our platelet demand and the kind of two supply streams that we have. So we have apheresis. So this is, you would go into a donor centre, you would sit on a usually a slightly more comfy chair because you'll be in there for a bit longer, and you'll be there for approximately an hour, and you can give around once a fortnight. Whereas whole bloods, you can donate in mobile teams, donate on mobile teams as well. So these are usually the community venues that we have, but you can only donate around 3 times a year. So what this means is that we have these two different supplies. So as I mentioned, we get some of our supply through platelet pooling. So it's around 53%, which is units that are given via whole blood through that pack type process that I mentioned, and we can extract the buffy coats from those and pool those together to make platelet units. Whereas apheresis, as I say, we collect directly from donor centres, and we have about 25 of those in the country where you can give platelets in. So how is this similar to whole blood? So we have a collection plan by ABO to meet that demand. And we also look to forecast and monitor our performance against plans. And again, similar to whole blood, we have problems with universal supply, so ANEG for platelets or ONEG for red cells. How is this different to whole blood? So for apheresis, we actually plan those targets all the way down to our donor centre level by ABO by day of the week. So it's a very granular level of detail that we plan to. We don't get to that granularity in whole blood. In terms of how we plan, they take into account the fact that we need to plan for platelet pooling as well. And as I've called out already, we do have problems with our ANEG demand, and our CD targets are disproportionately higher than what's available in the general population. And I've got a graph later on that will demonstrate that a little bit more. And again, in terms of platelet pooling, so as I say, we use a 4.4 assumption of whole blood units needed to make 1 platelet pool. So rather than if you came in and gave a unit of apheresis, or if you came in and gave a donation of apheresis, what we would probably find is that you would give 2 units of platelets, whereas in order to make the same amount from whole blood donors, you would need 8. But actually we know that not everyone is eligible for platelet pooling, so you would probably need more like 10 to 12 donors to donate to be able to get those same amount of units that you would get from one person giving apheresis. We also have to constrain it by manufacturing capacity. So manufacturing are obviously constrained by the amount of material and the amount of work they can do. Red cells, we have targets for, but we have less control over how many people are going to show up, or whether we're going to have people walk in and things like that. Whereas for platelets, because we're setting those pack type instructions I mentioned, we can work to a capacity within manufacturing to make sure that we are not giving them excess work that they won't be able to process. Other things to call out of why it's different. So we're relatively determined by how we create our CD targets. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a neg supply that we know we can't necessarily meet through apheresis. We don't have the donor base there ready to support that level of demand that we see. And we also do this one day in advance in terms of how we allocate. And again, I'll talk to you about that in a little bit. So the next one is just, what does this mean for us in terms of issuing platelet components? And like I say, it is a really complex component. And another reason it is complex is because of that shelf life. So as we talked about at the beginning, with the food industry and having a shelf life, actually this is our most complex product because of its shelf life as one of the other factors. So as well as having that dual supply chain coming through, we also have a really short shelf life to be able to issue these components. So what we have is a 7-day shelf life for this product, but actually when we look at how much time we have to spend in bacterial screening, along with the requirement for the shelf life to be a minimum of 48 hours on arrival for stock units into hospitals, you can see how quickly that shelf life becomes a very small window to be able to issue these units. So yeah, it does make planning quite complicated because of that shelf life, particularly over periods like Christmas. It's one of our hardest periods to plan because we don't have any donation sessions on Christmas Day, and we don't therefore pool any platelets or have any apheresis coming through on Boxing Day, and it just makes that period quite tricky to plan, particularly when we have to take into account that short shelf life. So not having production on that day or not having units coming through on that day does make things a little bit harder for us to navigate, and we do have to ensure we plan really well to support with trying to get what we need over Christmas periods. A second, or another reason I should say, as to what makes planning platelets complex is around our BACTI screening requirements and how that then effectively offsets our supply coming through by 2 days versus our demand. So what we see is higher supply coming through over the weekend when we offset it in that second graph. But actually what that means is earlier in the week, Monday, Tuesday, we see high demand and lower supply. So when we're planning within my team, we will quite often talk about the midweek stock dip. Our Wednesday is the day that we tend to focus on, or a Thursday if it's a bank holiday, because that's where we know in the week that that's likely to be our lowest point in terms of platelet supply coming through because of that offset that we see. So how do we plan all of this together? You're probably thinking, or hopefully thinking, well, there's a lot of complexities to take into account. And as I said before, we've got a number of different tools and processes that we use. Some apply to all products, not just platelets. So things like business planning from the outset. So we go through an annual period of business planning in around October time, ready for the next financial year. And we do that in terms of our collection requirements. And we also do that in terms of teams and team programs as well to determine where we collect from in the country for our mobile teams, or how often or what days of the week. Those are all discussions we have as part of our business plans, so that we can set from the outset what is going to be the plan for the coming year. We also have stock forecasts as well that we use to determine what's going on with supply coming through, which is having collections and issues data feeding into it, so we can understand how those are having a role or playing a part within impacting on our stock that we can see and the future forecast. And for platelets specifically, as I mentioned, very complex product to supply and to manage. But what we do is we do have a number of tools, and you can see I've listed some of the considerations that we have to take into account when we're planning this process, and we monitor them twice a day. So each day we'll be looking at platelet stocks twice a day, and adjusting those pack type instructions I mentioned accordingly, to try and make sure that we are pooling as much as we can, or pulling back on pooling if we're seeing high levels of platelet stock expected. And it's getting that balance right between, we want to ensure that we have enough supply ready for patients and to respond to any spikes in demand that we're seeing, but equally we want to make sure that we're not pooling so much that we're going to end up expiring units. And it's quite a delicate balance to get right between those two elements. And I should also say this is a really quite complex process to train. So we tend to have probably 3-4 weeks of training as a minimum when we're training out how to do this process. It's a bit of an art, I would say, to be able to plan platelet stocks well. Yeah, there's a lot to think about, as you can see, that we have to take into account to make sure that we are having those materials available for patients. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Again, I've probably got a record for how many times I've said it's complex, but I'm going to tell you it's complex again. So this is just showing you the different product combinations that we see. Again, this isn't my slide, but I do like it to be able to show how complex this process is. And actually what this tells us is, well, in my team, we're planning for 8 different types, or 8 options of platelets, if we look at it in these terms. And we do obviously know between apheresis and pooled what we've got coming through. There's actually extra factors that we do have to consider, and that adds up to 128 plus when we think about HLA, HPA at the end as well. But this means that we, for a small overall supply coming through, there's quite a lot of complexities to keep in distribution and availability for each of these different product combination types, considering that short shelf life, so we don't have lots of time to move products about. Just again showing how complex it is. And the final slide on platelets. So this, as I mentioned earlier, is just looking at our platelet issues compared to the UK population. So we see our platelet issues around 18%, and UK population is around, of ANEG, I should say, of UK population is around 7%. And what this means is that we do see a disproportionate amount of issues for ANEG and demand for ANEG platelets versus what we get through the doors. So it puts quite a lot of pressure on our platelet supply chain. And you can see here, so the red line, just make that a little bit bigger so I can tell you the right thing. The red line is showing a percentage of ANEG issues. So you can see that that is steadily increasing. And I don't know if you can make out the dates on this graph, but this is between April 2004 and April 2024. And what we've seen is those issues increasing from around 17.3% all the way up to 44.7 thousand. And it means that as a percentage, we're talking around 10 percentage points increase in ANEG platelet issues. And it does, like I say, put additional pressure on our platelet supply, because we are trying to manage that amount of supply that comes through. Equally, I think there's recognition of, we know that it is a short shelf life, so we know that this is going to be harder for hospitals to manage as well. but it's just showing you some of the challenges that we face from a supply side. And then finally, just talking about how we manage FFP and cryo demand. So this is just explaining a little bit. There's quite a lot of detail on this slide, but as I mentioned near the beginning, we have much more control over FFP and cryo supply compared to other products as we're setting these through production requests to manufacturing. So because FFP and cryo demand is all met through our whole blood coming through, and for the most part, except for AB, which I'll come on to in a second, for the most part, we can manage all of that supply and we can meet it within our current whole blood coming through. So we don't tend to see any issues with that supply because we can manage it quite carefully. Like I say, the exception is AB. We don't have enough raw material to be able to supply consistently to meet demand. And actually, what we've done recently is look to set up a project to look at AB supply across the supply chain, and we've worked closely with hospitals. Some of our clinicians have done that, which has been great. And actually we've seen, you can see it on that second chart at the bottom, we've seen a marked drop in the demand for AB, FFP, the orange line, which is brilliant. It's really helped us to be able to have more sufficiency of that group. So yeah, really good news there. And that is the last slide I had in my deck. I will have a quick look and just see if there are any questions.
There's a question in the Q&A. Would you like me to read that out?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, how do you match staffing resources to the fluctuation in plant collection when matching the peaks and troughs of demand?
Yeah, thank you. So when we set our business plan at the start of the year, or in October for the start of the year, what we have as part of that is our expected collection requirement. So what we'll be saying is, this is what we expect to collect by week, or this is what we expect our collection requirement to be by week. As part of that business planning process, we'll be looking at what teams do we need to be deploying and how much do we expect them to be collected individually by week. And that will give us an idea of how much we need to be collecting in each team to be able to meet those collection requirements. So when we set out those business plans, we set them using our capacity assumptions around what we know each team has got, and that drives the budget that we give each team as well. So we don't have particularly surge capacity. So, you know, if we were to see high prolonged spikes in issues, for example, we don't have surge capacity ready to dip into to be able to uplift that. But what we do have is, that's just slipped out of my head what I was going to say. It's gone. Come back to me.
That's okay. And then somebody asked at the end, could you expand a bit more about the red cell demand prediction process? Do you track the accuracy of your predictions? Do you have inputs to help predict spikes in demand? And how much above demand do you plan to collect to try to maintain a stable supply? Wow, that's a lot of questions. I can read them again.
That is. Let me see if I can open the Q&A so I can make sure I can see it. And I have just remembered what I was going to say on the last question. So when we set our stock calculations for red cells and for platelets and for plasma, actually, we don't do what you would do in maybe other supply chains around just-in-time methodology. So this is kind of where you would have a product ready to go, and you wouldn't necessarily have any inventory stock. You would manage it almost hand to mouth. So you would say, right, that person wants this and therefore we'll take it through the supply chain. So you would either have very minimal or no inventory management there. Because we need to be able to respond to those fluctuations in issues, we do have safety stock within our targets. And that's why our target stock range for red cells is set between 5.5 and 7 days, because actually that means that if we were to turn off collection tomorrow, we'd have enough stock at those target levels of 5.5 days, if we're at target levels, to be able to supply before we run out of stock. And that's why we have safety stock within this organisation, because we recognise that we do need to be able to respond to any spikes in issues, which hopefully helps. So that's that one. Red cell demand prediction process. Yes, well, I'll come on to this one now. So we do a process of discussion with our demand review group, as I mentioned. We also have statistical input on our forecast. So we'll look at things like population data to understand, what blood demand could look like. So it's quite an in-depth process. We'll also look at our assumptions around how much blood we're supplying to different departments, or different specialities. We've got kind of assumptions around that. And like I say, we will work with clinicians, our patient blood management team, and our blood stocks management scheme as well, around, are there any changes to demand that we're expecting, that we're forecasting. So we actually expect or predict demand about 5 years ahead, to try and give ourselves understanding of what could happen up to 5 years ahead. Obviously it becomes less accurate as you look further out, because we can't predict everything that's going to happen in 5 years. In terms of predicting the accuracy, and do we track it? Yes, we do. So we have monthly demand calls, and we do have a demand manager as well, so someone who does the same role as me but in the demand side, so looking at our demand and understanding that. Inputs to help predict spikes in demand. So I might need you to explain a little bit more about what you mean by the input. So I suppose we have intelligence from clinicians, like I say, and other colleagues. And how much above demand do you plan? So we plan to meet that demand. So we don't plan to collect above demand. We plan to meet demand. What we do is we will look to get to those safety stock levels I mentioned. So as at the minute, for example, we'll be looking to rebuild to make sure that we have got target stock levels of that 5.5 days as a minimum, just so that we know that we are sufficient to be able to respond to spikes appropriately. Next one was around AB women back to donate plasma. So it is something that unfortunately isn't done by NHS BT, as far as I understand it. I think it's a JPAC requirement rather than a NHS BT requirement. So there's more literature that I'm sure will explain it a lot better than I can, but there isn't the ability to be able to collect plasma from AB females for FFP and cryo, but we can collect PFM from female donors. So definitely encourage anyone interested that lives around one of the PFM sites to look into donating PFM if you are a woman. How do you manage the number of pack types sent to whole blood sessions to allow on-day decision? So this is, if I'm understanding this question correctly, Fiona. So what we will do, if I'm understanding the question correctly, as part of our pack type instructions, what we're doing is to say, this is how many platelet pools we need to make to be able to meet our platelet stock outlook, or our platelet stock forecast, to try and keep that within target stock levels. As part of that requirement, it will calculate how many boxes are needed to ensure that we have enough bags available on session, if that answers that question. Oh, did you want to come in, Fiona, or was that a... Oh yeah, perfect, thank you. So Raymond asking, what's the future of stock prediction / provision? So when you say the future, I don't know if I fully know what you mean. I don't know whether you wanted to come off mute and say that one.
So Raymond, if you put your hand up, I can unmute you and then you can ask your question. Thank you. Then go ahead.
I'm muted. There you go. So we've seen a lot of movement in hematology and transfusion with the integration of AI and things like that, especially in digital morphology and diagnostics. What's the future in terms of stock provision, stock prediction for blood transfusion? Are we looking at that kind of movement forwards there in your field, or is it just keeping to the better information gathering, leading to better predictions? And so it's just a general question, really.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So I guess more around that technology part that you're kind of looking to understand. So I suppose we don't use any of that sort of technology at the minute. We do have, as I say, like statistical support with some of our modelling from a demand side. But actually, from a supply side, we don't use any of those sorts of tools at the minute. It is more kind of complex spreadsheets that we do to produce a lot of this information. We are going through a period of looking at software and how we could use software a little bit more to be able to support some of our current supply processes. But yeah, I don't think we're quite there with AI supply chain stuff at the minute, although that would be really interesting. So the next one. So Rianne, I've just noticed in the chat that you've also asked a question. So let me
I've copied them. I've copied them all in Q&A.
Thank you.
No worries.
And this is from Ferguson. Has the move from emergency use ANEG platelets to APOS high-titer neg platelets improve/decrease the demand for ANEG platelets? It's a good question. We were talking about this yesterday in my team. So what we're seeing is at the minute we are finding that if we've got ANEG high-titer POS platelets, maybe a slightly different question, we don't tend to see them issued as much as we do when they're high-titer neg. We have seen recently a demand reduction, or I'm thinking about issues, an issues reduction in ANEG platelets, but we are still seeing high volumes or high levels of ANEG compared to what we can supply without having to rely on that additional red cell demand. So, question from Elizabeth. I often get asked why donors are turned away or not asked for their blood, and advised this can depend on their blood group and what is needed. I know individuals are contacted when their blood is required, but do you plan to communicate with disgruntled folk to explain why their blood is not required at present? So I do see this a lot as well myself when I kind of look at our Facebook pages. We do get donors that are saying, I'm not sure why I'm not able to be used. There is information on our website about which blood groups can donate. I think there is some information about AB positive females as well, because I know that is quite a common group that we do hear from, because we do cap that group completely so that AB positive females can't book an appointment. So I suppose I was just suggesting this to Selma before we started. We do have a team of donor experience or marketing, as you might more commonly know them outside of NHS BT, and they do a lot of communications with donors. So I think it'd be potentially a good session to have with them to talk to them about some of the communications that we see. So Rianne, in the plasma project group, how have you managed to reduce AB ordering? What group have you encouraged hospitals to order instead? Yeah, so it's been really successful. It's been work with one of our clinicians, like I say, looking at how can we order differently, or how can hospitals order differently to be able to support us. What we've been encouraging them to order is Group A rather than AB. And our literature, I believe, has changed as well to reflect that updated guidance to hospitals. So worth having a look at that for information too. Oh, I've lost my place in my questions. So, question around what processes are in place to ensure that donors are biologically male. So as part of the internal forms, we will record on a form what a donor's sex at birth is, because obviously for things like plasma products, we need to be able to ensure that we are only using sex at birth male plasma products within clinical or within FFP and cryo products. So that's what we use within that system. It's not something that a donor would be able to see because it's coded for staff's use. But yeah, we do have that within there. Next one is, can you please share, Leah-Kat, what key factors are used in your forecasting approach? Is it largely manual? Or are you using advanced tools or AI-driven technologies to support? What level of forecasting accuracy do you typically aim for, and how close are you getting to that benchmark? So we, as I mentioned in the plasma section, or in the platelet section, sorry, we use a lot of different approaches for supply forecasting. So I'll talk more about supply forecasting than demand forecasting. So we use lots of different tools within that process to be able to support the forecast that we look at going forward. But I suppose specifically for demand forecasting, as I say, we've got a statistical forecast, but no AI tools or anything like that at the minute. Our level of accuracy for a demand forecast at a total level is plus or minus 3%, which is pretty good. And in terms of expired numbers, do you mean units there? That might be a question back to you, Leah-Kat. There is a hand as well.
Yeah, Joseph, would you like to come in? I've unmuted you. Sorry, I've enabled your mic, so you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, in the slide there is a statement here saying that you are only able to manufacture plasma from males. So I want to find out why from only males but not females as well.
Yeah, so like I say, there is literature out there. I don't want to go into the literature because I will probably say the wrong way. But yeah, there is clinical reasons why we can't manufacture from female donors. It is something that's directed to us by JPAC, as opposed to something that's been decided by NHS BT. But yeah, it is something that we can't make FFP or cryo from female donors, but we can make PFM from female donors. So donors that come in and give whole blood, their units will go to PFM, which is plasma for medicine, I should say.
Yep, thank you very much.
No problem.
There's a question from Igor. Can you repeat which is the level of accuracy of your demand forecasting model?
Yes, it's plus or minus 3%. So it's pretty accurate at a total level.
And then Simone asked, maybe a silly question, but what's the rationale for rejecting, dissuading AB positive female donors?
Yeah, so as I say, it's not something I can give you a good clinical answer to. I don't know if we've got any clinicians on the call that can answer it, but yeah, it is something that's not, we can't allow female plasma to be donated due to JPAC guidance. Perhaps, Selma, we could find some literature and provide that at the end. I think that's quite a common question that's come up that I can share.
Sounds good, yeah. Edwin, let me unmute. You might be able to answer this. Okay. If you just unmute yourself.
I might have to slightly check the question, but female donors have a higher proportion of around about 10% have HLA or human leukocyte or human neutrophil antibodies in their plasma. And therefore, since we stopped using female donor plasma as the resuspending plasma in pooled platelets, and now we don't resuspend, they're resuspended in platelet additive solutions, so that's no longer an issue. But we used to not use them for that, and by computer control, fresh frozen plasma cryoprecipitate is not made from such donors, and female platelet apheresis donors are screened for HLA and HNA antibodies. And females tend to be a lower proportion of the apheresis platelet donors for that reason, as screening for HLA antibodies and HNA antibodies increases the costs on doing those. Does that answer the question? Actually, I wasn't sure I caught it fully.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just about we don't accept plasma from female donors for FFP and cryo. So I think there was just quite a few questions about why that is. And I think I've got an answer in my head, but I don't want to risk saying it out loud because I'm not sure it's quite right.
Yeah. So hopefully my answer answered that it's a built-in rule to reduce the risk of TRALI. TRALI was much more common in shot reports, and when they were reported prior to 2004, when this was brought in over 20 years ago, the rates of finding a donor with antibodies amongst the donors to whom the recipient was exposed with HLA or HNA antibodies was 95%, and the number in which those antibodies were found to be incompatible with antigens on the recipient was 75%. And now those levels are kind of reduced to the kind of the random chance level. So if somebody has had 2 packs of red cells, one of which was from a female, and a pack of pooled platelets, one of which included 2 females, the chances that we will find antibodies in the donors of those male and female red cells and platelets is about that of random chance that you'd find in people who received a transfusion and had no respiratory deterioration. So it's been a very, very effective measure. And effectively what we do now in testing donors in suspected TRALI cases is excluding donors because we are not finding an excess of HLA. That had to be completely statistically calculated, but we're effectively not finding an excess of antibodies now. So it's not really a diagnostic test. It doesn't prove the case. It's history that proves the case, but it has massively reduced the risk of TRALI as a result of donor-derived HLA or HNA antibodies.
Thank you. Answered much better than I would have done.
Thank you so much. There's one last question. Do we have time for that?
Yeah, no problem.
Ferguson. Q&A.
Q&A box. In terms of contingency planning, how much flexibility is there in the system for things like major incidents, large-scale military operations, or war fighting at scale? For example, are you easily able to accommodate an increase in demand of 100, 200, 500, 1,000 ONEG red cells per week? And how long would you require to meet this demand? Okay, so as I say, we obviously don't, routinely plan for these sorts of events to take place, in the sense of we don't have specific stock allocated for this sort of thing. But when I talked about safety stock, so what we do have is we look to have a target of that 5.5 to 7 days of stock available for hospitals, so that if we do see a spike in issues, we are able to respond to that spike in issues. So yeah, like I say, maybe not specifically thought about in that way, but we do have stock, or we do target to have stock available for between that 5.5 and 7 days worth of inventory, so that we are able to have some safety stock if we do see spikes in issues.
Brilliant, thank you.
No problem.
I think we've covered all the questions. Thank you everyone for contributing and I guess supporting Harriet in answering some of these questions. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. The SHOT team has kindly asked me to share the My Transfusion app, which was designed to support safe and informed transfusion care. So there's a QR code available here, so please do download it and have a look at it. Do email us if you have any other questions for Harriet. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer. We can find someone who can.